Calloway was 7 years old when he learned that love could be packed away like outgrown clothes. It happened gradually at first, in the small, quiet ways that children notice but cannot yet name. His parents, Seraphine and Thorn, had been young when they had him, barely into their 20s, still chasing degrees and promotions and the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside. Seraphine was finishing her master's in literature, spending long evenings hunched over books in the living room while Thorn worked late at the law firm, coming home with takeout containers and tired smiles that never quite reached Calloway. The house was always clean, always orderly, but it felt more like a showroom than a home. Calloway's toys were kept in neat bins, his drawings rarely made it to the refrigerator, and dinner was often whatever could be microwaved quickly while his parents discussed adult things, bills, deadlines, weekend plans that never included him. He remembered asking questions once, simple ones like why the moon followed the car, or how birds knew where to fly south, and watching Seraphine's shoulders tense as she answered in short sentences without looking up from her laptop. Thorn would ruffle his hair absently and say, "Not now, buddy," before turning back to his phone. At family gatherings, everything changed. Seraphine would brush his dark curls until they shone, dress him in the nice button-down shirts that itched at the collar, and parade him around like a trophy. "Look how smart he is," she'd say, prompting him to recite the alphabet backward or name all 50 states, things he'd practiced alone in his room just to earn that fleeting pride in her voice. Thorn would hoist him onto his shoulders in the backyard, tossing a football back and forth loud enough for the neighbors to hear the laughter. Calloway lived for those moments, hoarding them like secret treasures, because at home, the silence returned as soon as the guests left. He learned early that being seen was conditional, tied to audiences and appearances. One evening when he was 6, he confided in his grandmother during a rare visit, whispering that his parents never played with him when no one else was around. That night, he heard raised voices from the kitchen, Seraphine's sharp tone, Thorn's low rumble, and the next day, Thorn sat him down on the living room couch, knees level with Calloway's eyes, and explained in a voice that brooked no argument that family business stayed inside these walls. "We don't air our laundry, Cal. If you tell anyone again, there will be consequences." Calloway nodded, throat tight, unsure what consequences meant, but certain he didn't want to find out. School became his escape and his struggle. In first grade, the notes started coming home. Declining grades, trouble sitting still, forgotten homework, scuffles on the playground. Calloway wasn't trying to be bad, he just didn't know how else to fill the emptiness. Being good earned him nothing but invisibility. Being disruptive, at least, brought his parents into the same room as him, even if it was to yell or send him to the corner for hours, nose pressed to the wall until his legs went numb. He escalated slowly, knocking over displays in grocery stores, talking back to teachers, refusing to complete assignments, each act a desperate flare sent up into the void, hoping someone would notice the boy beneath the behavior. Seraphine and Thorn responded with punishments, but never questions. No one asked why he was acting out, if something hurt, if he felt alone. They simply took away privileges, grounded him, sighed heavily as if he were an inconvenience interrupting their real lives. Around his 7th birthday, the air in the house shifted. Seraphine had been tired more often, napping in the afternoons, smiling in a soft, secret way that Calloway didn't understand. They held a small party, just the 3 of them in the kitchen, a store-bought cake with blue frosting and 3 mismatched presents wrapped in leftover paper. Calloway was halfway through unwrapping a puzzle when Seraphine placed Thorn's hand on her stomach and announced she was pregnant. Thorn's face transformed, eyes wide, mouth breaking into a grin that lit the whole room in a way Calloway had never seen directed at him. They hugged tightly, laughing and crying, completely forgetting the half-opened gifts on the table or the boy sitting frozen with paper in his lap. For the first time, Calloway saw what unreserved joy looked like in his parents, and it wasn't for him. It was for the new baby, the one they clearly wanted more. 3 weeks later, he came home from school to find Seraphine in his bedroom, folding his clothes into an old blue suitcase. The sight stopped him in the doorway, backpack sliding from his shoulder to the floor with a thud. "What's happening?" he asked, voice small. Seraphine didn't answer at first, just continued pairing socks with precise movements. Thorn appeared behind her, filling the frame, and explained that Calloway would be going to live with Aunt Marigold, Seraphine's older sister, up the coast. "You're not thriving here, Cal," using the same reasonable tone he reserved for difficult clients. "Marigold's place is quieter. It'll be better for you." The words landed like stones in Calloway's stomach. He begged. He promised to be better, quieter, invisible if that's what they needed. He swore he'd eat every vegetable, never ask for another toy, get straight A's if they'd only let him stay. When words failed, he dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around Thorn's leg, clinging as his father tried to step away. He screamed until his throat burned raw, tears and snot soaking Thorn's slacks. Seraphine never turned around. She just kept folding, 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 as if packing away a life was as ordinary as laundry. The next morning, they drove north, the suitcase rattling in the trunk. Calloway tried every bargain a 7-year-old mind could invent. Promises of perfect behavior, offers to clean the whole house, pleas to at least wait until after Christmas. Nothing penetrated the wall of their decision. Marigold's bed and breakfast appeared at the end of a winding gravel road, a weathered Victorian house painted soft gray with white trim, perched above dunes and seagrass. Marigold waited on the wide wraparound porch, her silver-streaked hair tied back, wearing a faded apron over jeans. She was unmarried, childless by choice or circumstance, and had turned her inheritance into this haven for travelers seeking quiet and homemade scones. When the car stopped, she opened Calloway's door herself and enveloped him in a hug that smelled of salt air and cinnamon. No hesitation, no stiffness, just warmth. She led him inside past the registration desk carved from driftwood, up creaking stairs to a small room at the back overlooking the ocean. The walls were the color of sea glass, the quilt pieced from old maritime flags, a shelf lined with shells and fossils collected over decades. "This is yours," she said simply, setting the suitcase down. Thorne and Seraphine stayed 2 days, ostensibly to help him settle, but they spent most of the time in the kitchen drinking coffee with Marigold, reminiscing about childhood summers, while Calloway sat alone on the blue bedspread, tracing starfish patterns with his fingertip until the ridges left marks on his skin. Meals were polite but distant. Bedtime came with perfunctory kisses on the forehead. The next morning they left, Seraphine finally looked at him fully, her eyes glassy but resolute. "Be good for Aunt Marigold," she said, brushing an invisible speck on his shoulder. Thorne ruffled his hair one last time and murmured something about calling soon. The car crunched down the gravel drive and vanished around the bend. Calloway stood on the porch until the dust settled, then something inside him quietly shattered. For the next 3 weeks, he moved through the house like a ghost. He ate only when Marigold placed food directly in front of him and sat watching with infinite patience. He slept in fits, waking from dreams of empty rooms and closing zippers. Marigold never pushed. Instead, she told stories while she worked, tales of shipwrecks visible at low tide, of guests who left behind love letters in the guest book, of the way moon snails laid their perfect collars of eggs in the sand. She spoke softly as she polished brass fixtures or folded linen scented with lavender sachets. Slowly, Calloway began to respond, a nod when she asked if he wanted more milk, a whispered thank you when she tucked him in. One afternoon, he followed her to the linen closet and handed her towels without being asked. She smiled, eyes crinkling, and pressed a warm dollar bill into her palm. "For a job well done, you've got the makings of a fine innkeeper." The words settled in him like the first sunlight after fog. At the local school, he met children who didn't judge, made a friend who shared sea glass finds at recess. His new teacher sent home notes praising his curiosity and improvement. Marigold pinned every one to the refrigerator with colorful magnets shaped like starfish. Phone calls from Thorne and Seraphine came fitfully at first, awkward questions about grades, promises of visits that never materialized. Marigold offered the receiver each time, but Calloway's answers grew shorter until he stopped taking the calls altogether. After a few months, the ringing 12 years had passed since the blue suitcase zipped shut on Calloway's childhood, and in that time he had grown into a young man who knew the weight of stability because he had once carried the absence of it. At 19, he was in his second year of hospitality management at a small coastal college an hour's drive from Marigold's bed and breakfast, close enough to spend most weekends back at the gray Victorian house that had become his true north. The B&B was thriving in its quiet way, steady bookings from birdwatchers, writers seeking solitude, and couples celebrating anniversaries with champagne on the porch at sunset. Calloway had become indispensable. He had modernized the reservation system with online software that synced across devices, painted the trim a fresh white every spring, learned to troubleshoot the ancient boiler before guests noticed the hot water faltering, and could predict occupancy trends by studying weather patterns and local festivals. Marigold taught him the subtler arts, too, how to read a guest's mood in the slope of their shoulders when they checked in, how to leave a handwritten note and a piece of sea glass on the pillow of someone traveling alone, how to balance the books so that the business supported itself without draining her savings any further. On weekends, he drove back with a backpack full of textbooks and laundry, and the moment the gravel crunched under his tires, the tension of exams and dorm life loosened in his chest. Marigold always met him at the door with a hug that lingered, as if confirming he was still real, still hers. They would cook together, clam chowder thick with cream, cornbread studded with rosemary from the garden, and talk about everything, his classes, her plans to replace the roof before the next winter storms, the way the dunes shifted each year like slow breathing. It was a life built on presence, on showing up day after day, and Calloway had come to understand how rare and precious that was. One Saturday in early spring, the air carried the first hint of warmth, and the crocuses along the walkway had pushed through the soil in defiant purple. Calloway was in the laundry room off the kitchen, helping Marigold fold a mountain of white towels still warm from the dryer. The scent of lavender detergent filled the small space, and sunlight slanted through the window onto the stacks of linens. They worked in a comfortable rhythm, trading stories about a particularly demanding guest who had complained about the excessive sound of waves at night. Marigold laughed softly, shaking her head, and Calloway was midway through mimicking the man's indignant tone when the old house phone on the wall rang, 3 sharp trills that cut through the quiet like a warning. Marigold wiped her hands on her apron and lifted the receiver. "Seashell Inn, Marigold speaking." She listened for a moment, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to something guarded, almost wary. Her eyes flicked to Calloway, and she held out the phone. "It's for you," she said quietly. The look she gave him carried weight, a silent question. "Are you ready for this?" Calloway's stomach tightened as he took the receiver. He hadn't heard their voices in years, except in passing at family obligations, and even then only distant pleasantries. "Hello?" he said, keeping his tone neutral. There was a pause, then Thorne's voice, deeper than he remembered, polished the way it always was when addressing someone he wanted to persuade. "Cal, it's Dad." The word dad landed awkwardly, like a stone dropped into still water. Calloway leaned against the counter, gripping the phone tighter. "Hi," he answered, offering nothing more. Small talk followed, Thorne asking about college, the program, his grades. Calloway answered in short sentences. Classes were good, he was maintaining a high GPA, the campus was fine. Seraphine came on the line then, her voice softer but with that same performative warmth she used at parties. She congratulated him on his academic success, said how proud they were, how they always knew he had potential. Calloway waited, sensing the pivot coming. It arrived when Thorne cleared his throat the way he did before delivering closing arguments. "We've been thinking a lot lately," he said, "about family, about second chances. We'd like you to come home after you graduate, Cal, reconnect, be part of things again." The words hung in the air. Calloway glanced at Marigold, who had paused mid-fold, watching him with quiet concern. He took a slow breath. "Why now?" he asked. "After 12 years of almost nothing, why now?" There was silence on the other end, a rustle as the phone changed hands again. Seraphine came on the line then, her voice softer but with that same performative warmth she used at parties. She congratulated him on his academic success, said how proud they were, how they always knew he had potential. Calloway waited, sensing the pivot coming. It arrived when Thorne cleared his throat the way he did before delivering closing arguments. "We've been thinking a lot lately," he said, "about family, about second chances. We'd like you to come home after you graduate, Cal, reconnect, be part of things again." The words hung in the air. Calloway glanced at Marigold, who had paused mid-fold, watching him with quiet concern. He took a slow breath. "Why now?" he asked. "After 12 years of almost nothing, why now?" There was silence on the other end, a rustle as the phone changed hands again. Seraphine came on the line then, her voice softer but with that same performative warmth she used at parties. She congratulated him on his academic success, said how proud they were, how they always knew he had potential. Calloway waited, sensing the pivot coming. It arrived when Thorne cleared his throat the way he did before delivering closing arguments. "We've been thinking a lot lately," he said, "about family, about second chances. We'd like you to come home after you graduate, Cal, reconnect, be part of things again." The words hung in the air. Calloway glanced at Marigold, who had paused mid-fold, watching him with quiet concern. He took a slow breath. "Why now?" he asked. "After 12 years of almost nothing, why now?" There was silence on the other end, a rustle as the phone changed hands again. Seraphine came on the line then, her voice softer but with that same performative warmth she used at parties. She congratulated him on his academic success, said how proud they were, how they always knew he had potential. Calloway waited, sensing the pivot coming. It arrived when Thorne cleared his throat the way he did before delivering closing arguments. "We've been thinking a lot lately," he said, "about family, about second chances. We'd like you to come home after you graduate, Cal, reconnect, be part of things again." The words hung in the air. Calloway glanced at Marigold, who had paused mid-fold, watching him with quiet concern. He took a slow breath. "Why now?" he asked. "After 12 years of almost nothing, why now?" There was silence on the other end, a rustle as the phone changed hands again. Seraphine came on the line then, her voice softer but with that same performative warmth she used at parties. She congratulated him on his academic success, said how proud they were, how they always knew he had potential. Calloway waited, sensing the pivot coming. It arrived when Thorne cleared his throat the way he did before delivering closing arguments. "We've been thinking a lot lately," he said, "about family, about second chances. We'd like you to come home after you graduate, Cal, reconnect, be part of things again." The words hummed in the air. Calloway glanced at Marigold, who had paused mid-fold, watching him with quiet concern. He took a slow breath. "Why now?" he asked. "After 12 years of almost nothing, why now?" There was silence on the other end, a rustle as the phone changed hands again. Seraphine came on the line then, her voice softer but with that same performative warmth she used at parties. She congratulated him on his academic success, said how proud they were, how they always knew he had potential. Calloway waited, sensing the pivot coming. It arrived when Thorne cleared his throat the way he did before delivering closing arguments. "We've been thinking a lot lately," he said, "about family, about second chances. We'd like you to come home after you graduate, Cal, reconnect, be part of things again." The words hung in the air. Calloway glanced at Marigold, who had paused mid-fold, watching him with quiet concern. He took a slow breath. "Why now?" he asked. "After 12 years of almost nothing, why now?" There was silence on the other end, a rustle as the phone changed hands again. Seraphine came on the line then, her voice softer but with that same performative warmth she used at parties. She congratulated him on his academic success, said how proud they were, how they always knew he had potential. Calloway waited, sensing the pivot coming. It arrived when Thorne cleared his throat the way he did before delivering closing arguments. "We've been thinking a lot lately," he said, "about family, about second chances. We'd like you to come home after you graduate, Cal, reconnect, be part of things again." The words hung in the air. Calloway glanced at Marigold, who had paused mid-fold, watching him with quiet concern. He took a slow... The weeks following the initial call blurred into a tense standoff, with Thorne and Seraphine's attempts at contact growing more insistent, more frantic. Calloway blocked numbers as fast as they appeared, deleted messages unread when he could, but the persistence wore on him like sand in a shoe, small, constant irritation. Midterms loomed at college, piling stress upon stress. He buried himself in group projects, financial modeling for hypothetical ins, case studies on guest satisfaction metrics. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the buzz of his phone on silent mode, lighting up with yet another unknown caller. He told himself he was fine, that their words couldn't reach him anymore, but exhaustion thinned the armor he had built over 12 years. Marigold noticed. Of course she did. She left extra muffins on the counter when he visited, slipped chamomile tea into his travel mug, reminded him gently that he didn't have to carry this alone. But Calloway kept most of it inside, determined not to let Thorne and Seraphine disrupt the life he had earned. One rain-lashed afternoon in late April, he was back at the dorm after a grueling exam week, sprawled across his narrow bed with textbooks scattered like fallen leaves. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in days, his eyes burned, thoughts fragmented. The phone rang, another new number. Something in him snapped, a brittle twig under too much weight. He answered not out of curiosity, but raw fatigue, no longer willing to play the blocking game. Thorne's voice filled the line immediately, clipped and demanding. "Cal, we need to talk. You've been incredibly disrespectful. An apology would go a long way toward healing this family." The word family landed like a slap. Calloway sat up slowly, pulse thudding in his temples. For the first time in years, the careful control he had cultivated slipped. He didn't speak calmly, he yelled. The words poured out, years of stored silence erupting like a dam finally breached. "You don't get to call me disrespectful," he shouted, voice cracking. "You abandoned me at 7 because I was inconvenient. You shipped me off the moment Elowin was on the way, like I was a broken appliance you could store elsewhere. And now you want me back as a prop to parade me around so your friends stop whispering about what bad parents you are?" He paced the small dorm room, phone gripped white-knuckled. He told them everything he had never said before, how Marigold had attended every school play, standing in the front row with flowers, how she helped with science fair projects until midnight without ever sighing, how she celebrated every A, every small victory with genuine pride. "She was there," he said, voice shaking, "every single time. You sent checks that barely covered groceries, and she dipped into her retirement to make sure I had clothes that fit, books, a real life. You gave me nothing but absence." Thorne tried to interrupt, defensive as always, citing the financial support, the difficult decision they had made for his benefit. Calloway cut him off. "You failed me completely, and you're failing Elowin the same way, just in reverse. You ignored me until I acted out, then got rid of me. With her, you throw money and gifts, but no boundaries, no real attention. She's shoplifting, throwing tantrums, and you call her a failure? She's 11. She's screaming for you to see her the only way she knows how." Seraphine came on the line then, voice trembling with what might have been tears or anger. She defended the shoplifting as a single mistake, insisted they had learned from past errors, done better with Elowin. Calloway laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "If you'd done better, why does she repeat my exact pattern? Why does her behavior only matter when it embarrasses you in public?" He paused, breathing hard, and then spoke the truth he had carried for years. "You don't want to be good parents. You never have. You want to look like good parents. Your whole relationship with us, with both your children, has been about image, keeping up appearances for friends, family, neighbors. That's all we've ever been to you. Accessories." The line exploded. Thorne shouted over Seraphine's protests, calling him ungrateful, spoiled by Marigold's indulgence. Seraphine accused him of tearing the family apart, and then Thorne delivered the final blow, voice raw with fury. "We're glad we sent you away. You were never good enough. We chose Elowin over you, and we'd do it again." The words hung in the silence that followed, ugly and irreversible. Calloway waited for the pain, waited for the old fracture to reopen, for tears or rage or devastation. But nothing came. Only a profound emptiness, like a room swept clean. Their cruelty couldn't touch him anymore. It only confirmed what he had known deep down. They hung up amid more shouting, the line going dead with a click. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the rain streaking the window. Strangely, he felt lighter. Their worst had been spoken aloud, and it had no power left. When he drove to the B&B that weekend, he told Marigold everything over tea in the kitchen, voice steady. She listened without interrupting, then reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you for saying it," she said softly. "And maybe, hearing it so plainly will finally make them look at what they're doing to Elowin." Calloway wasn't optimistic. They had never shown real self-awareness before, but he clung to the slim hope that his confrontation might plant a seed, might spare his sister further damage. A few days later, an unexpected message arrived, a text from a number he didn't recognize, but the name attached was Rowena, Thorne's mother, a grandmother he had seen only sparingly over the years. She and Gideon had heard fragments of the escalating situation from various relatives and wanted to hear his side directly. No pressure, just lunch if you're willing. Calloway hesitated, then agreed. They met at a quiet cafe halfway between the coast and the city, neutral ground. Rowena and Gideon were older than he remembered, silver-haired, lines etched deeper, but their eyes held genuine remorse. Over sandwiches and coffee, the conversation stretched into hours. Calloway told them everything, the neglect, the public pretense, the abandonment, the way Marigold had pieced him back together. He spoke of the recent calls, the demand to return as a success story, the final ugly fight. Rowena's eyes filled with tears, Gideon's jaw tightened. They admitted they had harbored suspicions years ago, but lacked concrete proof to intervene. "We should have pushed harder," Rowena said quietly. "We failed you too." Seeing Calloway now, confident, thriving, planning a future with Marigold's business, only deepened their regret. As they parted, Rowena hugged him tightly. "You turned out wonderfully," she whispered, "in spite of them, not because of them." Driving home, Calloway felt the ripples spreading. Family gossip, once firmly in Thorne and Seraphine's favor, had begun to shift. Relatives were asking questions, noticing the timing of the sudden outreach to Calloway right after Elowen's very public troubles. The carefully curated narrative of selfless parents making a difficult choice for their troubled son was starting to crack. Calloway took no pleasure in their discomfort, but there was a quiet justice in it. The truth, held back for so long, was finally finding its way into the light. In the weeks after the explosive phone confrontation, an unexpected quiet settled over Calloway's life. The unknown numbers stopped appearing, no new texts, no fabricated social media accounts, no voicemails laced with guilt or rage. Thorne and Seraphine had retreated, licking their wounds, or perhaps regrouping. Calloway didn't know, and for the first time, didn't care to guess. The silence felt less like peace and more like the hush before a storm breaks elsewhere. He focused on finishing the semester strong, driving to the B&B most weekends to help Marigold prepare for the summer rush. They updated the website with new photographs of the sunrise over the dunes, refreshed the online reservation calendar, and repainted the Adirondack chairs on the porch a deeper shade of seafoam green. Guests were already booking solid from June through August, drawn by reviews praising the homemade breakfasts and the quiet that felt like a held breath. Calloway's internship application at a luxury resort had been accepted. The experience would sharpen his skills for the day he and Marigold expanded the business, perhaps buying the neighboring property for more rooms or a small cafe serving local seafood. Life moved forward in steady, satisfying increments. Yet beneath the calm, ripples were spreading through the extended family. Thorne and Seraphine, according to fragments Marigold heard from cousins and old friends, were fighting a losing battle to contain the narrative. They insisted Elowen's shoplifting had been an isolated incident, a phase exaggerated by gossips. But the stories kept coming. Notes from teachers about disruptive behavior in class, talking back, refusing to complete assignments, moments of defiance that echoed Calloway's own desperate bids for attention years earlier. Each report chipped away at the image of the perfect replacement child they had cultivated. Relatives who once accepted their version of events, noble parents making a sacrificial choice for a troubled son, began to question. The timing of their sudden desire to reclaim Calloway, mere weeks after Elowen's very public embarrassment, had not gone unnoticed. Whispers turned to conversations. Conversations turned to confrontations. Marigold, after 12 years of measured silence, finally spoke her truth. When relatives called or visited, curious, concerned, sometimes skeptical, she told them plainly what she had witnessed. She described the frightened, withdrawn boy who arrived with one suitcase and hollow eyes. She recounted how his behavioral problems dissolved within months, replaced by curiosity, good grades, and a willingness to help anyone who needed it. He didn't need a quieter town, she told one cousin over tea on the porch. He needed parents who saw him. Word traveled quickly in a family long accustomed to Thorne and Seraphine's polished explanations. Apologies began to arrive, texts and emails from aunts, uncles, even distant second cousins who admitted they had believed the special needs story without question. "We should have asked more," one wrote. "We should have visited you more." Calloway read them with a mix of vindication and sorrow. The validation was welcome, but it came laced with the reminder of how thoroughly he had once been erased. The most significant shift came from Rowena and Gideon, Thorne's parents, the grandparents Calloway had rarely seen even before the abandonment. Their lunch meeting after the confrontation had opened a door neither side had expected. They stayed in touch cautiously at first, texts checking on his exams, a card when he aced a difficult course. Then one evening, Rowena called Marigold directly. She and Gideon had been gathering information quietly. Calloway's account, Marigold's observations over the years, recent teacher reports on Elowen, statements from relatives who had witnessed Thorne and Seraphine's dismissive or overly permissive parenting. They were deeply worried, Rowena said, that history was repeating itself in a more dangerous way. Where Calloway was discarded for being inconvenient, Elowen was being alternately spoiled and scapegoated, her cries for help labeled as defiance or failure. At 11, she was vulnerable in ways a 7-year-old boy had been, and the stakes felt higher. With Marigold's blessing and Calloway's full support, Rowena and Gideon petitioned for temporary custody. The process moved with surprising speed, perhaps because the evidence painted a clear pattern, perhaps because judges recognized neglect even when it wears expensive clothes. Teachers provided documentation of Elowen's escalating struggles and the parents' minimal engagement. Family members submitted affidavits attesting to the sudden outreach to Calloway as damage control rather than genuine reconciliation. The judge granted temporary custody pending a full hearing. One gray morning in late spring, Elowen moved into Rowena and Gideon's comfortable suburban home 2 hours inland, a house with a wide backyard, a dog named Juniper, and bedrooms already prepared. Calloway heard the news from Rowena herself, voice thick with both relief and grief. She was quiet in the car, she said. Didn't cry, didn't argue, just stared out the window. When we got home, she asked if she was in trouble. Calloway's chest tightened at the image, an 11-year-old girl believing she was being punished for existing wrongly. Rowena promised updates, assured him they would provide the structure and affection Elowen needed. Regular meals, consistent bedtime, therapy appointments already scheduled, school meetings attended without excuses. They were pursuing permanent custody with supervised visitation rights for Thorne and Seraphine, believing gradual, accountable contact might one day be possible if the parents showed real change. For Calloway, the development brought complicated emotions. Relief, certainly, that Elowyn had escaped the cycle before it hardened into deeper damage. Anger, too, at how long it had taken the family to act, how much pain might have been prevented if someone had intervened when he was 7. But mostly, he felt a cautious hope. Rowena sent occasional photographs. Elowyn sitting at the kitchen island eating pancakes, Elowyn brushing the dog in the backyard, Elowyn holding a book with a tentative half-smile. She looked smaller than he expected, darker hair than his own, eyes wary but curious. The numbness Rowena described in the first days was familiar. Calloway remembered those weeks of barely eating, barely speaking, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But slowly, structure worked its gentle magic. Elowyn began helping with small chores, setting the table, walking the dog. Her shoulders relaxed. She asked questions about school supplies and whether she could choose her own bedding. Thorne and Seraphine's isolation grew. Attempts to portray themselves as victims, unfairly targeted by meddling in-laws, fell flat as more relatives learned the full history. Family group chats buzzed with newfound clarity. Invitations to gatherings dwindled. Calloway heard they were considering a move to another state for a fresh start, the same solution they had once applied to him when he became inconvenient. The irony was not lost on anyone. Driving back to the B&B one weekend, salt wind whipping through the open windows, Calloway felt the ripples settling into something like justice, not vindictive, but restorative. The facade his parents had built for over a decade was crumbling under the weight of truth, and in its place, space was opening for something real, a chance for Elowyn to heal, for Calloway to continue building the life Marigold had given him, for the family to finally see clearly. The ocean stretched wide and steady beside the road, indifferent to human drama, but constant nonetheless. Calloway smiled, small but genuine. The worst was over. What came next could be better. The summer tourist season was in full swing when the first message from Elowyn arrived. Calloway was behind the registration desk at the B&B, checking in a couple celebrating their 10th anniversary, when his phone buzzed softly in his pocket. He excused himself for a moment, glanced at the screen, and saw an unknown number with a simple text. "Hi, this is Elowyn. Grandma Rowena said it was okay if I messaged you." His thumb hovered over the reply button. He had pictured this moment many times since learning she had moved in with their grandparents, but now that it was real, his chest felt tight with a mixture of nerves and something softer. Hope, maybe. He stepped out onto the porch where the late afternoon sun slanted golden across the dunes. The sound of waves rolling in provided a steady backdrop as he typed back, "Hi, Elowyn. It's good to hear from you. How are you doing?" The reply came almost immediately. "Okay, I guess. It's weird being here. Grandma makes me eat breakfast every day. She says you used to live here too." Calloway smiled at the small, hesitant question. He could almost hear the uncertainty in her words. They texted for a few minutes, safe, surface-level things. Favorite colors? Hers was lavender. His had become sea glass green. Whether she liked dogs. She loved Juniper, Rowena's golden retriever. What she thought of the beach. She'd only seen it once and wanted to go again. Then she asked the question he had been bracing for. "Why did you leave when I was born?" Calloway took a long breath, watching a gull wheel overhead. He chose his words carefully, honest but gentle. "Mom and Dad decided they couldn't take care of me anymore. They sent me to live with Aunt Marigold when I was 7. It was really hard at first, but Marigold was kind to me. She helped me feel safe. I've been happy here ever since." He didn't mention the suitcase, the screaming, the promises that were never kept. Not yet. Elowyn's next message took several minutes to arrive. "They told me you were bad, and that's why you left. That you'd make me bad too if we talked." Calloway's stomach twisted. He typed slowly. "I wasn't bad. I was just a kid who needed attention. I think you're probably just a kid who needs attention too. You're not bad, Elowyn. You're 11. That's allowed to be hard." The conversation paused for a while. He didn't push. Later that evening, after the last guests had gone upstairs and Marigold was washing dishes, his phone lit up again. A voice message this time. Short, shy. "Grandma said I could call you tomorrow if you want, after dinner. Is that okay?" Calloway listened to it twice, hearing the tremor in her young voice. He replied, "That would be really nice. I'll be here." The first call happened the next evening. Rowena dialed from her landline, handed the phone to Elowyn, and stepped away to give them privacy. Calloway sat on the porch swing, feet propped on the railing, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of peach and violet. Elowyn's voice was quieter than he expected, almost fragile. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he answered, keeping his tone light. "How was dinner?" She told him about the spaghetti Rowena had made, how Gideon had burned the garlic bread, but everyone pretended it was fine. Calloway laughed softly. "Gideon always burns the bread. He did it when I visited, too." They talked for 20 minutes, about school, she hated math but liked art, about the dog, Juniper slept on her bed every night, about the B&B, she asked if there were ghosts, he said only friendly ones who liked scones. When she asked what his room looked like, he described the sea glass walls, the quilt made from old sailor flags, the shelf of shells. "You can see it someday," he said, "if you want." After that first call, they spoke a few times a week. The conversations grew longer, less guarded. Elowen shared small frustrations, how Rowena made her do homework before screen time, how Gideon insisted on bedtime stories even though she was too old. But she also shared brighter things, the way Juniper's tail thumped when she came home from school, how Rowena taught her to bake cookies, how she had started drawing pictures of the ocean even though she'd only seen it once. Calloway listened more than he spoke, letting her fill the silences. When she asked about his childhood with their parents, he answered honestly but without bitterness. They were busy a lot. I spent a lot of time alone. When I acted out, they got mad instead of asking why I was upset. Moving here was scary, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Elowen's next message took several minutes to arrive. They told me you were bad, and that's why you left, that you'd make me bad too if we talked. Calloway's stomach twisted. He typed slowly. I wasn't bad. I was just a kid who needed attention. I think you're probably just a kid who needs attention too. You're not bad, Elowen. You're 11. That's allowed to be hard. The conversation paused for a while. He didn't push. Later that evening, after the last guests had gone upstairs and Marigold was washing dishes, his phone lit up again. A voice message this time. Short, shy. Grandma said I could call you tomorrow if you want, after dinner. Is that okay? Calloway listened to it twice, hearing the tremor in her young voice. He replied, that would be really nice. I'll be here. The first call happened the next evening. Rowena dialed from her landline, handed the phone to Elowen, and stepped away to give them privacy. Calloway sat on the porch swing, feet propped on the railing, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of peach and violet. Elowen's voice was quieter than he expected, almost fragile. Hi, she said. Hi, he answered, keeping his tone light. How was dinner? She told him about the spaghetti Rowena had made, how Gideon had burned the garlic bread, but everyone pretended it was fine. Calloway laughed softly. Gideon always burns the bread. He did it when I visited, too. They talked for 20 minutes, about school, she hated math but liked art, about the dog, Juniper slept on her bed every night, about the B&B, she asked if there were ghosts. He said only friendly ones who liked scones. When she asked what his room looked like, he described the sea glass walls, the quilt made from old sailor flags, the shelf of shells. You can see it someday, he said, if you want. After that first call, they spoke a few times a week. The conversations grew longer, less guarded. Elowen shared small frustrations, how Rowena made her do homework before screen time, how Gideon insisted on bedtime stories even though she was too old. But she also shared brighter things, the way Juniper's tail thumped when she came home from school, how Rowena taught her to bake cookies, how she had started drawing pictures of the ocean even though she'd only seen it once. Calloway listened more than he spoke, letting her fill the silences. When she asked about his childhood with their parents, he answered honestly but without bitterness. They were busy a lot. I spent a lot of time alone. When I acted out, they got mad instead of asking why I was upset. Moving here was scary, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Elowen's mom was quiet for a long moment. I act out too, she whispered. They call me spoiled or a brat. Sometimes they just ignore me when I'm loud. Calloway swallowed hard. That sounds really hard, he said. I'm sorry you're going through that. You deserve someone who listens even when you're not being perfect. One weekend, Marigold suggested inviting Elowen for a short visit. Just a day or two, she said. Let her see what a home can feel like when people show up for you. Calloway hesitated, worried it might be too much too soon, but Rowena and Gideon thought it was a good idea. They believed Elowen needed to see different models of family, different ways of being cared for. They arranged it for the following month, during a quieter week before the peak of tourist season. Calloway spent the days leading up to it, quietly anxious. He cleaned his old room until it shone, bought lavender-scented soap for the guest bathroom, asked Marigold to make extra blueberry muffins. Elowen had mentioned liking blueberries once in passing. The morning of the visit, Calloway waited on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching the gravel drive. When Rowena's car appeared, his heart thudded. Elowen stepped out slowly, clutching a small backpack. She was smaller than he had imagined, dark hair in a loose braid, eyes wide and watchful. Rowena gave her a quick hug and whispered something encouraging before driving off with a promise to return the next afternoon. Elowen stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at Calloway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said very quietly, "You're taller than I thought." He smiled, crouching down to her level. "And you're braver than I was at 11. Want to see the room?" She nodded. They walked inside together. Marigold greeted her with a warm hug and a plate of muffins. No pressure, no performance. Elowen explored the house slowly, touching the driftwood carvings, peering into guest rooms, lingering at the window that overlooked the beach. When Calloway showed her his old room, she stood in the doorway for a long time. "This was yours?" she asked. "Yeah, still is when I visit." She stepped inside. The summer deepened into long, golden days at the B&B, with every room booked and the porch humming with guests sipping iced tea while watching the tide. Calloway split his time between college classes, now mostly online during the internship, and helping Marigold manage the influx. The adjacent property had officially gone under contract. They were in the early stages of planning an expansion. 6 more guest rooms and a small cafe serving breakfast to the public, featuring Marigold's legendary scones and local clam chowder. Calloway handled the numbers, sketching budgets and projected revenue, while Marigold dreamed aloud about garden seating and string lights. Elowen's visits became a regular rhythm. After that first tentative weekend, Rowena and Gideon encouraged more. She came every other weekend, then weekly during school breaks. Each arrival felt less like a guest and more like family returning home. The change in her was gradual but unmistakable. When she first stepped out of the car, backpack clutched tight, her eyes had darted everywhere, waiting for criticism or dismissal. Now she bounded up the porch steps, waving before Rowena's car even fully stopped. She had grown an inch, her braid longer and often adorned with a seashell clip Marigold had given her. The wary tightness around her mouth had softened into ready smiles. She helped without being asked, stripping beds with practiced flips of sheets, carrying trays of muffins to the breakfast tables, charming guests with shy stories about Juniper, the dog. Marigold taught her the same lessons she had once taught Calloway: how to fold napkins into swans and lilies, how to read the clouds for incoming weather, how to listen to a guest's silences as much as their words. Elowen soaked it up like parched ground after rain. Evenings were Calloway's favorite. After the dishes were done and the guests settled, the three of them would sit on the porch swing or walk the beach as the sun dipped low. Elowen collected sea glass with fierce concentration, building a jar that grew fuller each visit. She and Calloway developed small rituals, racing to spot the first star, sharing the last cookie from the batch, trading stories about school. She talked more openly now, about therapy sessions with a kind counselor who helped her name feelings instead of acting them out, about how Gideon read aloud every night, even when she pretended to protest, about how Rowena attended every parent-teacher conference and asked questions that made teachers smile instead of sigh. When she spoke of Thorne and Seraphine, it was with a puzzled distance. Supervised visits had begun, short, structured meetings in a neutral office. "They ask about my grades," she said once, kicking sand as they walked, "but not really about me." Calloway nodded, understanding too well. He never badmouthed them outright, but he didn't sugarcoat either. "Sometimes people care more about how things look than how people feel," he said. Elowen considered this, then slipped her hand into his. The gesture, small, trusting, lodged in his chest like sunlight. Back in the wider family, the unmasking continued. Thorne and Seraphine's carefully constructed narrative unraveled thread by thread. Relatives who once nodded along to their version of events now heard Marigold's quiet truths, Rowena's measured accounts, even Elowen's own hesitant words when asked gently. The special needs story that justified sending Calloway away crumbled under the evidence of his thriving life. The sudden outreach to him after years of silence, timed perfectly with Elowen's public troubles, exposed the pattern too clearly to ignore. Invitations to family gatherings dried up. Holiday cards returned unopened. Whispers at weddings and funerals were no longer sympathetic, but skeptical. Thorne and Seraphine responded with defensiveness at first, emails and calls portraying themselves as victims of a vindictive campaign led by bitter in-laws and an ungrateful son. But the audience had shrunk. Fewer people listened. Fewer believed. Calloway heard through Rowena that they had begun talking seriously about moving, selling the house, relocating to another state for a clean slate. The phrase echoed painfully. It was the same solution they had applied to him. When a child became inconvenient, remove the problem and start fresh. Only this time, the child they wished to escape was the one they had kept, and the fresh start would come without either of their children. Rowena's voice on the phone was sad but resolute. "They're running from consequences instead of facing them, but we won't let them run with Elowen." The custody hearing loomed closer, evidence mounting in favor of permanent placement with Rowena and Gideon. Therapists' reports highlighted Elowen's progress in a stable environment. Teachers noted improved focus and fewer outbursts. Thorne and Seraphine's attendance at required meetings was sporadic, their engagement minimal. Calloway felt no triumph in their isolation, only a weary recognition of how predictable it was. They had always prioritized image over substance, and now the image had cracked beyond repair. He focused instead on what was growing in the space they left behind. One weekend in late August, Elowen arrived with a sketchbook full of drawings, the B&B from the dunes, Marigold pouring coffee, Calloway laughing on the porch swing. She presented it shyly after dinner. "For you guys, so you remember when I'm not here." Marigold's eyes filled. She pulled Elowen into a long hug. Calloway flipped through the pages, throat thick. The drawings were simple but vivid, full of light and motion and care. That night, as fireflies blinked over the lawn, Elowen asked if she could call Marigold Aunt Marigold, like Calloway did. Marigold answered by pulling her close and kissing the top of her head. "I'd like that very much." Later, when Elowen had gone to bed in the sea glass room, Calloway and Marigold sat on the porch with cups of chamomile tea. The moon hung low and silver over the water. "She's healing," Marigold said quietly. "The way you did." Calloway nodded. "Because she's with people who stay." He thought of Thorne and Seraphine packing boxes in a house that would soon belong to strangers, pretending the problem was geography instead of themselves. He felt no desire for reconciliation, no lingering ache for their approval. The chapter had closed, not with shouting this time, but with quiet finality. Elowen's laughter drifted down from an open window as she talked to Juniper on a video call with Rowena. Calloway smiled into the dark. The facade his parents had built for so long was gone, stripped away by truth and time. In its place stood something sturdier, a family stitched together by choice and presence, growing stronger visit by visit, day by day. The waves rolled in steady and sure, erasing footprints in the sand, but leaving the shore itself unchanged, resilient, enduring, open to whatever light came next. Autumn slipped into winter along the coast, the tourist season fading into quiet months where the B&B hosted only occasional writers seeking solitude or couples escaping city holidays. The gray Victorian house stood steadfast against salt winds, its windows glowing warm against early sunsets. Calloway, now 20, had finished his hospitality management degree with honors and was fully immersed in running the business alongside Marigold. The neighboring property had closed escrow. Renovation plans were pinned to a corkboard in the office. New rooms with wider ocean views. A cafe with outdoor seating under planned pergolas draped in wisteria. They worked side by side in the evenings, spreadsheets open on the kitchen table, debating paint colors and menu ideas while soup simmered on the stove. Elowin, 12 now and settled permanently with Rowena and Gideon after the final custody hearing, spent every school break at the coast. The judge had granted Thorne and Seraphine supervised visitation rights, but they rarely exercised them. Word came through family channels that they had indeed moved across states to a place where no one knew their history, chasing the illusion of a fresh start without the children who had complicated their image. The house they left behind sold quickly. The proceeds vanished into their new life. Few relatives mentioned them anymore. Calloway stood on the porch one crisp January morning, coffee steaming in his hands, watching Elowin and Marigold plant lavender along the front walkway. The ground was cold but workable, and Elowin knelt in an oversized coat, pressing small plants into the soil with careful fingers. Her cheeks were pink from the wind, her laughter carrying over the crash of waves as Marigold teased her about getting dirt under her nails. The sight settled something deep in Calloway's chest, a quiet, enduring wholeness. He had once been the frightened 7-year-old arriving with one suitcase, convinced he was broken. Now he watched his sister thrive in the same place that had saved him, guided by the same steady hand that had pulled him from silence. Elowin had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The wary child who once flinched at raised voices now spoke freely, argued playfully over board games, asked endless questions about everything from tide pools to college applications. Therapy had given her words for the confusion and hurt of her early years. Rowena and Gideon's consistent presence had shown her that rules could come with kindness, boundaries with love. School reports glowed, straight A's in art and science, teachers praising her empathy and curiosity. She still collected sea glass obsessively, her jar now overflowing onto a dedicated shelf in the sea glass room she claimed as hers during visits. Calloway had added a second bed, a desk scattered with her sketchbooks, walls adorned with her drawings of the ocean in every season. Their sibling bond had deepened into something effortless. They shared inside jokes, Gideon's perpetually burnt toast, Marigold's habit of humming off-key while baking. They took long walks on the beach at dusk, skipping stones and talking about the future. Elowin wanted to study marine biology someday, inspired by the coastal life she now knew. Calloway teased her about becoming a famous scientist who named a new species of crab after him. She rolled her eyes but grinned. When she asked about their biological parents, rarely now, and only when something triggered a memory, he answered with calm honesty. "They weren't capable of giving us what we needed," he said once, as they watched seals bask on distant rocks. "But that doesn't mean we're missing anything important. Look around." She followed his gaze, to Marigold waving from the porch, to the house lights flickering on against the gathering dark, and nodded slowly. Rowena and Gideon visited often, driving down with Juniper in tow for long weekends. The 5 of them filled the house with easy conversation and laughter. Meals stretched long at the big oak table, evenings spent playing cards or watching old movies. Gideon, once a distant figure in Calloway's memory, now shared stories of his own imperfect parenting with Thorne, expressing regret for not intervening sooner. Rowena baked pies that rivaled Marigold's and taught Elowin to knit, their heads bent together over yarn in matching armchairs by the fire. Calloway watched these scenes with a gratitude too vast for words. The family he had lost had been replaced, not perfectly, not without scars, but with something chosen, deliberate, enduring. One evening in early spring, as the first crocuses pushed through the lavender beds, Marigold gathered them all in the living room. The fire crackled. Juniper snored softly at their feet. She held a thick envelope, hands trembling slightly. Inside were updated legal papers. She had officially become Elowin's co-guardian alongside Rowena and Gideon, ensuring the girl would always have a permanent place at the coast if she wished. Elowin read the document slowly, eyes wide, then launched herself into Marigold's arms with a sob that was half joy, half release. Calloway joined the hug, feeling Elowin's small frame shake between them. Later, when the others had gone to bed, he and Marigold sat on the porch under a blanket of stars. "You gave us both a home," he said quietly. Marigold squeezed his hand. "You gave me a family," she answered. "I always wanted children. I just didn't know they'd come to me one at a time, carrying their hurt in suitcases and backpacks." Years later, when the expanded B&B stood complete, new rooms filled with guests, the cafe bustling with locals and travelers alike, Calloway and Marigold ran the inn together until she retired gracefully, passing the keys to him with pride. Rowena and Gideon remained constants, holiday gatherings, birthday calls, quiet support through life's ordinary challenges. Thorne and Seraphine faded into rumor and silence. Occasional postcards arrived from whatever new city they inhabited, generic scenes of skylines, brief notes about jobs or weather, but Calloway and Elowin let them go unanswered. There was no anger left, only indifference. The people who had discarded them had become irrelevant, their absence no longer a wound, but simply a fact, like the tide going out. On the porch one quiet evening years after that January planting, Calloway stood with Elowin beside him, both older now, watching a new generation of guests arrive. Marigold dozed in her favorite chair inside, Juniper's successor curled at her feet. Elowin leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked softly. Calloway considered the horizon where sea met sky. "Sometimes," he said, "but mostly I think about this." He gestured to the house, the lavender swaying in the breeze, the laughter drifting from open windows. Family, he had learned, was not defined by blood or birth certificates. It was defined by who showed up, who stayed, who made room in their heart even when it was hard. Marigold had done that for him at 7. Together, they had done it for Elowen at 11. And now, in the steady rhythm of waves and seasons, they continued doing it for each other and for every guest who crossed their threshold seeking rest. The porch light glowed gold against the dusk. Calloway felt the old fracture lines in his heart, not as scars, but as places where light had entered. He was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by the family he had chosen and who had chosen him back.